very great pleasure to introduce Jessie Ford to you tonight. Jessie's from Atlanta, and she went to Brown for her undergraduate and got a PhD from NYU and is now a postdoctorate studies at Columbia in sociology, particularly, well, she'll tell you all about it. I just want to say that this is the highlight of my summer to introduce this. Jessie's dad and I were cousins, and anyways, it's my pleasure.
I'm going to be talking today about men's accounts of unwanted sex, the importance of social expectations, and masculinity. And as I'm looking out into the audience tonight, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces from my extended Cape family. Hi, Susans, Nan, Rosemary, John, Mom. I've been coming to Truro, Wellfleet, every year since I was 2 years old, and even though I was raised in Atlanta, we would travel so far, and we looked forward to this so much every summer. Currently, I'm now a sociologist in gender and sexuality, and I am doing my postdoctoral research fellowship at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University. And I do have a background in public health. Before I went into sociology, I worked a lot in HIV prevention, and I worked for several years at the CDC before doing my doctorate work. And I'm really looking forward to sharing my data with you today. I've made some assumptions about this audience, which may or may not be accurate. I've made some assumptions that you're not sociologists, though some of you may be. And if I were giving this talk at a conference, I might have included or gone more into less or more detail on some things, but I've tried to tailor it more for a summer library talk. So, in order to situate the work that I'm presenting today, I want to contextualize it in what we know about sex on campuses. The term hooking up, which gained popularity in the 1990s, is a somewhat ambiguous term that students generally understand to mean anything from kissing to intercourse that occurs outside of a romantic relationship with no expectation of future contact. Let me say that again. A hookup is anything ranging from kissing to sex that occurs outside of the context of a relationship, and there's not an expectation that you'll talk to the person afterwards. And there's been a significant amount of research on hookup culture in recent years, and some of it has suggested that sexual assault is part of this cultural phenomenon. For example, we know that participation in hookups increases your likelihood of having experienced sexual assault by the end of college. And the sexual assault of women on U.S. college campuses has very much become a subject of increasing public interest in the U.S. amidst the broader Me Too movement. While in office, Obama drew a lot of attention to this issue, and researchers have increasingly been focused on measuring the prevalence of sexual assault. An estimated 14 to 26% of women will experience sexual assault while in college. And this statistic is widely published. It's been used in a lot of prevention efforts, and it makes sense that these numbers are well known because women experience higher rates of assault. What is interesting is that in these same national survey studies, they have found that somewhere between 6 and 13% of college men have experienced sexual assault. So how could this happen? How could a man have sex that he does not want? Is he being physically overpowered? Men have to get erections. How does this work? At this point, you might be imagining it's male-on-male assault. However, a recent study of over 24,000 college students called the Online College Social Life Survey revealed that of the sexual assault on recent hookups and dates, only 18% of it was with other men. Over 80% of it was men with women. So I'm going to start here with this as my dilemma. This is the dilemma I wanted to understand. Why are men having unwanted sex? What does this mean? And while women are experiencing a significant amount of sexual victimization, At the same time, there are these men who are experiencing this. So I imagine some of you are wondering, what are the questions men are asked to elicit these responses? So here they are. Since you started college, have you had sexual intercourse that was physically forced on you? Has someone had sexual contact with you when you were unable to provide consent or unable to stop what was happening because you were incapacitated? Have you had sexual intercourse when someone verbally pressured you? And you may notice from these questions that there's no language of rape or sexual assault. And the reason this is because it's well known in survey design that people tend to underreport, which is why terms such as unwanted and non-consensual are the preferred way to collect data as opposed to directly asking people about rape or crime. And so while survey data is telling us what are the numbers, they do not answer this question of how or why. And so this is why I needed qualitative interviews. So my research design involved 39 interviews with college men who'd had unwanted sex with women and 17 with men. And in this talk, I'm going to focus more on the interviews of men who had unwanted sex with women. Later in the talk, I'll make some brief comparisons from men with men. And for my purposes, rather than calling the experiences that I described today sexual assault, I'm going to call them unwanted sex, since this was the term men were most comfortable with in interviews. Although many of the men were quick to point out that if the same thing had happened to a woman, they might consider it sexual assault. These 56 men were recruited through campus flyers and through a survey given to 500 students in an introductory class. And one thing I want to say is that as qualitative researchers, we are and we need to be very mindful of ourselves as instruments of data collection. And I suspect that as a white woman in my 30s, I was able to collect certain kinds of data. Had I been a male, I might have collected different types of data. And although I was concerned that I was a female interviewer, and I was concerned that I might have less rapport for this reason, I also recognize that male policing of masculinity is such that men might be less likely to tell a male interviewer about an unwanted sex that they had with a woman than they would be likely to tell a woman who they didn't know very well about it. So overall, I found that most men were eager to talk about their experiences, and that my difference in age and gender was not a barrier to open and frank discussions. So these interviews lasted 45 minutes on average. Some were as long as 2 hours. And for those of you who don't know, what we do as qualitative researchers, we record these interviews, we transcribe them, and then we spend a lot of time inductively trying to find emergent patterns in the data. We look for themes, and we call this coding. And coding is used to build themes, which we use to try to make judgments and interpretations about the meaning of what we're finding. So I'm going to move into my findings now. I'm going to open with 3 quotes from men, and I'm going to start asking you to look for patterns, for words that stick out to you. And then I'll start bringing in some theory and some interpretation. In a first quote here from Jeff, he tells us, or I ask him, "You said you felt pressure to keep going." "Definitely." "Was that from her?" "Yeah, I kind of felt it was me too, based on the situation. Felt like I had to go all the way. It was just necessary." "Necessary?" "Yeah. Why not stop it? It would have felt weird to me. I can't see myself. I don't know. I wouldn't have done that." In the next quote here from Jack, I ask, "What if you'd stopped it?" "Yeah, she might think I was a little strange." "Strange?" "Like she got rejected. I think she would just feel weird or surprised." And then a quote from Tyler. "I didn't really want to be in that position because sex was still something that was kind of an emotional thing for me. But then I also didn't want to say anything because I thought it would be kind of weird." Weird? "It would make the situation awkward. It would probably de-escalate into nothing." Okay, so you've seen 3 quotes here, and you may have begun to see some patterns. you may have noticed that the men assign certain words to things. Words like strange, awkward, weird, rejected, surprised, to what would have happened if they had stopped. And as sociologists, we look for words that indicate meaning for the individuals. And something that I found early in the interviews was that male respondents were talking not so much about uncontrollable biological urges or powerful female seductresses. They were talking more about this normative commitment to keep the interaction going smoothly. So I'm going to bring in some theory now. So we have 3 quotes from men where they weren't overpowered, they could have stopped it, they didn't stop it. So why? So Irving Goffman, a famous sociologist, theorizes that it takes work to maintain a certain presentation of self, what you might call saving face, and that in interactions, people are trying to avoid embarrassing themselves, they're trying to avoid embarrassing another person, they're trying to be polite, to avoid discomfort, shame, ridicule. And research indicates that even during sex, a very intimate and physical interaction, people try to save face and to smooth over interactions. So if we think back on our quote from Tyler, he seeks to avoid the encounter becoming awkward or ending abruptly. Jack doesn't want this woman to feel rejected or surprised. He doesn't want her to lose face. Harold Garfinkel, another famous sociologist, argues that in addition to acting in ways that save face, people also try to act in ways that make sense. They try to construct meaning out of what's happening in the moment, and people generally conform to what is expected. And in doing so, they maintain a sense of social order. So disrupting, or what Garfinkel calls breaching, acceptable social scripts is not only undesirable and uncomfortable, it's also fraught with social meaning. And so what we see in these quotes is the men realizing that if they do certain things, it will breach social protocol. And the men don't want to do this. So let's move to another quote. I'll give you a backstory quickly. I'm going to talk about Adam. During a party, a woman kisses Adam. And when the party ends, the woman continues to hang out. Adam is cleaning up. He tries to politely give her hints to leave. He says the party's over. And she just wouldn't leave, in his words. So Adam eventually has sex with her rather than ask her to leave. And he didn't want to have sex that night with her, he tells me, because he was actually interested in another woman at the party. He was also tired from hosting, and it was late. Adam says, I could have told her to leave, but I didn't. I guess I didn't want to be rude. Yeah, I'm not very confrontational. I can't imagine telling her to her face I want her to leave. That would have been harder for me to do than going through with it. So here we begin to see how sex and the expectations of hookup culture operate to increase the pressure of casual sex. But we also see the power of the interaction. When I ask him why he didn't more overtly ask her to leave, Adam says he can't imagine asking her to leave or explaining that he doesn't want to have sex, which might cause them both to lose face. So he has sex to smooth the interaction. And instances where people sustain interactional smoothness, even when it's disadvantageous to their broader goals, have been documented elsewhere. Here we see it operate to produce unwanted sex. Adam describes the sex that night as unsatisfying, impersonal, meaningless. He tells us, I even faked an orgasm. That was a first. I didn't think guys ever had to do that. Even physically, it didn't feel good enough to make me climax. There was just nothing there for me. It appears that to smooth the interaction, Adam feigns the most polite exit of all, a proper climax. And this serves to save face for Adam and his partner. And by doing this, he ends the interaction in an acceptable way, an action in line with traditional sexual scripts that dictate that sex ends with male climax. In an extreme version of interactional smoothing, it appears that both participants had sex for the other. Jeremy says, so that's when I told her, yo, I wasn't that into last night. She says, yeah, I could tell, but that's what I thought you wanted, so I thought I might as well. I said, wait, you thought I was pressuring you? She says, yeah, no, I wasn't. You were pressuring me. Was that sex unwanted? I don't think either of us wanted it, but we were in a situation where we didn't communicate. It wasn't rape, but it was unwanted. So there are many layers here. They are mutually participating in something they don't want to do. So we have to ask, why are they doing this? And what I've tried to argue and demonstrate here is that in some regard, we are captives of interactional pressures and scripts. And they sometimes make us do things that we don't want to do, like engage in polite conversation with someone on an elevator that we don't particularly like. And if interactional pressures are indeed contributing to unwanted sex, this is the exact kind of absurd situation we would expect to see. In this instance, the desire to keep the interaction running smoothly may be substantial enough that both people end up doing something they don't want to do. So more theory. Up until now, we've talked about the pressure of the interaction in a kind of generic way. By generic, I mean we've talked about pressure to avoid embarrassment, humiliation, pressure to be polite. But now I'm going to bring in gender. In sociology, the way we think about gender is that it's not so much biological given, but it's something that's learned and performed through interactions. So in this instance, sex becomes another interactional site where gender performance is evoked and reinforced. Doing gender, or the idea that gender is performed during interactions, is a big idea in sociology. And the idea is that this performance is assessed based on social norms about gender. So just to repeat that again, gender is not a given, it's something that's accomplished in everyday interactions. And importantly, individuals cannot prevent the fact that other people are going to hold them accountable to their gender and expect them to behave in ways that make sense for their gender. Therefore, people perform gender in order to make sense and to be understood. And importantly for men, there are specific social norms around gender associated with being a man. For example, expectations for men to always want sex, to perform masculinity by having it, so that conceivably, even if a man doesn't want to have sex, he might still have it for the purpose of performing his gender. Because to not perform his gender could result in ridicule, confusion, shame, and other negative social consequences. So one way that the power of gender performance became clear in this data is through fears of ridicule. Men worried that not having sex could result in them being seen as a wuss, someone who's a virgin, an idiot, or someone who's gay. Men told me they had sex to project an image, to keep up a reputation, and to take advantage of an opportunity. Men also worried what women thought about them. They seemed to believe that their behavior with women mattered because women's accounts would be credible to other students after the fact. So let's bring in this notion of gender now. In Tyler's words, so I just let it continue. Physically, I'm not so adverse to it that I'm going to shut this whole thing down. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking about this girl telling weird stories about me to her friends. I don't want to be that guy where she's like, that guy is weird. I thought we were going to have sex. And then there's also an undercurrent to my thought making is that guys are supposed to enjoy sexual intercourse under any circumstances. As Tyler tells us more about unwanted sex, it becomes clear that it's not just a matter of facilitating a smooth interaction. This is also a loaded interaction. Saying no or breaching the current encounter could have consequences. He could be that guy. And there are also broader expectations that Tyler references here, that men always enjoy sex. And this might remind you of what I said earlier in my talk, that people can't really conceive of men having unwanted sex because there's this script that they're expected to perform. Therefore, objecting to sex risks being seen as abnormal or emasculated. So to avoid this, Tyler opts to do his gender, to perform masculinity by having sex. Max has unwanted sex with a woman from his dorm. After leaving a party together, their friends encourage them to leave together. He tells me although this woman was attractive, he was really happy with their relationships as friends and didn't want to take it to the next level. In the interview, I say to him, "You said you have had sex that was forced on you. Was it this time?" "Yeah, that was that time." "What do you mean?" "I feel like it was just so many people had been saying it that we should hook up for so long that it was like, this is not going to stop, so I might as well. Then kind of just because she wanted it. I couldn't really shrug her off or something once she started kissing me in the elevator. That would have been weird to me." In the elevator back to the dorm, she begins kissing him. The encounter progresses into sex, which Max describes as physically forced on the in-class survey. And when I probe him further, Max clarifies that although the woman didn't use physical force, it felt as if the sex was forced on him by the situation. And according to Max, the peer pressure was not going to stop. He decides to go ahead with it, perhaps to save face in line with gender norms so his friends will stop policing him, but also because once she begins kissing him, it's hard to leave. And so in a final quote here from Greg, he clearly articulates how gender norms work jointly with interactional processes to facilitate unwanted sex. Greg says, or I ask, "It's hard for men to say no?" "Yeah, it's uncomfortable." "How is it uncomfortable?" "Because first, I don't really like to make people feel bad about themselves. Also, there is this social pressure that men like sex a lot and women can choose yes or no. So I guess it makes you unmanly if you don't want to have sex." For Greg, saying no to sex is uncomfortable. In a generic, non-gendered sex, it can make someone feel bad if you turn down their invitation. She could lose face, he could lose face, and the action might not make sense. Next, gendered expectations are layered onto this, where turning down sex becomes unmanly. Women in particular may feel bad if their sexual invitation is rejected. And due to sexual double standards where women are judged more harshly for interest in sex, women may particularly feel rejected. With these pressures combined, some men have unwanted sex. So, in summation, my analysis produced a lot of evidence showing that interactional processes matter, saving face, making sense. These things have real consequences. Sometimes disrupting the interactional flow is so costly that it becomes easier to have unwanted sex than to make the encounter awkward or embarrassing. Thus, either men or women may go along with sex because in a generic sense, it's easier than turning down someone's offer. However, in reality, I also argue that these processes are not really gender neutral and generic because in addition to these interactional pressures, there's also this idea that a lot of what is expected depends on one's gender and the associated expected performances. So sometimes interactional dynamics only push towards unwanted sex because gender norms informed how men were supposed to act, what they were expected to want, and what actions are considered acceptable. For example, men feared being made fun of by others and considered a wuss if they turn down a sexual opportunity. Therefore, I argue that some of what occurs to produce unwanted sex can be explained by these generic interactional pressures, but much of what occurs cannot, because what it means to save face, what it means to make sense, is largely informed by a person's gender and the associated expected gender performances. Importantly, these findings challenge a lot of existing assumptions about masculinity. Much work shows that men in general are most concerned with impressing other men. And on occasion, the literature on masculinities discusses the ways that girls and women police the expressions of masculinity. However, in general, men are seen as the most consequential audiences for policing masculinity. And there's kind of this assumption, particularly in the literature on hookup culture, that men's opinions of women, particularly women who are willing to hook up, are so low, and the credibility that they think that women have in reporting on this is so low that there's really no reason to be polite in private interactions. And my findings really challenge these assumptions because they suggest that women have more power than is otherwise understood because women's accounts have consequences for men's sense of self. If it's true that boys and men care what women think, then women's support for more diverse performances of masculinity could challenge hierarchies of power. And my results also have indirect implications for a debate in the literature around sexual assault. There's often this debate that when men sexually assault women, that they're either malicious and it's purposeful or that they're just confused. And on one side of the debate, the idea is that these men are young, they're drunk, they're clueless, and that a lot of sexual assault results from miscommunication. The other side argues that men understand women's refusals, but deliberately force sex anyway. And, for example, some research shows that in other contexts, men can read women's social cues about refusal, so why can't they read it during sex? Therefore, it's implausible that men can't do this in sexual situations. And importantly, the men I interviewed here are clearly skilled interactional actors. And this level of sophistication that they talk about in managing the interactions and thinking about themselves and the other begin to suggest that men's explanations of perpetration that attribute it to inept social skills may be improbable. So without much time to go in depth here, I'm going to briefly turn to the experiences of men with men. And I'm going to share some of my preliminary data on gay and bisexual men who reported unwanted sex with other men. And this is an extremely important group to study because some data suggests that their rates of sexual assault mirror those documented in heterosexual women. And frankly, I could give a whole other talk on the social processes that facilitate unwanted sex for gay and bisexual men. What I will show here is that in some ways their stories are similar. I find that this desire for interactional smoothness extends across sexual orientation. So Justin tells us, I don't think he acted maliciously. I don't think he realized how intimidated I was. I think it was more, here's a guy, I think if I said I wasn't into it, he would have stopped, but I felt pressured just off the situation. It was less so what he said to me and more the situation at hand, which is what made me go through with it. So, much like heterosexual men here, Justin is describing a scenario where he could have said no but did not based off the situation. And this situational pressure led other gay and bisexual men to go through with it, to ride it out. And again, we see this here when he explains that it's not so much that his partner is being malicious as much as he feels pressure to go through with it due to expectations embedded in the interaction. However, as a sub-theme to all of this, I do want to bring in one point, and that is in contrast to heterosexual men and women, sometimes queer students described scenarios where they did not feel they had a clear scripted guide for how the interaction would unfold. So some of this relates to inexperience, but it also relates to a dearth of cultural schemas and scripts for how sex between two men, or two women for that matter, should unfold. So Gabe, a bisexual man says, I went to a gay bar. Some guy just put his hand down my pants. There have been times when I'm not really sure exactly what it is. It's just sort of happening, and I'm like not into it. Here, Gabe suggests he's not actually sure what is supposed to happen here. It just sort of happens. And due to the presence of broader heteronormative expectations, where a heterosexual script is the only one widely available, many gay men in particular, and also a few queer women, describe not necessarily having a roadmap for how to navigate sexual encounters to stay safe. And in some instances, gay and bisexual men in my sample did not recognize that they were unsure of what the expectations were until they were midway into an encounter, when they realized they had no idea what was supposed to happen. Without more time to go in depth on this here, I would point out that this seeming absence of scripted content was sometimes used either deliberately or subconsciously by partners to push more inexperienced gay and bisexual men into unwanted sex. Another distinct finding for men was this notion of the potential for violence. Lincoln says, "On the way, I was super scared. I felt like I was going to die in a way. We end up in his apartment. He tries to pour me some wine, but I refuse to drink it because I'm not sure what's in it. And he keeps on untying my pants and I don't want it. I was like, could we talk first? And he just kept doing it. I didn't know how to react." In line with the literature, my analysis of interviews produced this evidence showing that women and anyone having sex with men has to also attend to this possibility of violence, because sometimes it's a realistic threat. And while in contrast, men having sex with women, heterosexual men, do not even talk about this potential for violence. They don't worry about it, and they don't even consider the possibility of violent escalation in their accounts. So this leads me to implications. These results become important when we situate them next to the findings on gay and bisexual men. So I found in interviews that some gay and bisexual men and also some women talk about avoiding awkwardness, and this can lead to unwanted sex. In these accounts, however, the interactional smoothing often combines with something more pernicious, this idea that men are bigger, that they could snap. And this leaves women and gay bisexual men with more constrained options. So in other words, anyone having sex with a man in unwanted sex, there becomes this space where the interactional pressures meet with the structural pressures, men's physical and social superiority. Whereas for men, unwanted sex, heterosexual men, unwanted sex is almost exclusively about the interactional. And my findings suggest that this implication has this has implications for traumatic effects. Although more research is needed, heterosexual men largely told me that they believed they had unwanted sex by their own volition, that it was their choice. As a result, they did not frame these encounters as sexual assault, and they reported few adverse effects afterwards. So while much research has been conducted on women, more research is still needed, I think, to compare the accounts of men and women. We need to understand the gendered content of norms and how these work in sexual scripts. For example, men claim that rejecting or avoiding sex is weird or strange. Do women draw upon similar language in their accounts? Or are there differing ways that women account for unwanted sex? And does the expectation that men want sex more than women, or the existence of a sexual double standard where women are judged more harshly for engaging in casual sex, does that give women more freedom to stop events from leading to unwanted sex? And if this is true, if women are more able to stop events because they have the power to say no, then when women have unwanted sex, perhaps more coercion has been involved. And in terms of the broader Me Too movement and the sexual assault movement for women, one thing that's really good is that part of what's happening is that it's making it less of a breach to get consent or to say no. And so potentially what's exciting here is that part of the way this might actually work is not just by empowering women, but also by creating a space for men as well as women to say no. So I'm going to stop here. Me too, creating more space to say no. And I'm going to move into questions, comments, maybe even a discussion as a group. I'd love to hear what you think. Thank you so much for coming out. And I'm excited to tell you more, to answer any questions. Yes.
I have a question about your sample size. How did you arrive at that number to say, well, this is enough to make the generalizations that I'm going to seek to make in writing your thesis? It seems low to me.
Yeah.
But maybe you were getting the same response over and over again. I mean, to base your generalizations, at least with the gay community, on 17 responses.
Yeah.
And I think it was 34 or something on the other.
39.
39. It just seemed, so my question is, how did you arrive at that sample size?
Yes, so I can give you actually, my full study was 110 students. So it was a lot. So I interviewed slightly more women. But to be honest, with this kind of qualitative interview, the interviews were 45 minutes up to 2 hours. They're really long, rich interviews. And one thing that happened within the first 8 or 10 interviews was this idea of saturation. So the men started to say some of the same things. So I started to hear some of the same words, the same explanations for why they had unwanted sex, and things started to repeat. And I kept doing interviews for, I think by 30 interviews, I kind of had more than enough data, and the story was pretty clear, but I did another 9 because my goal was to get as close to 40 as possible for the heterosexual men in particular. And to be clear, the majority of my thesis, my dissertation, was actually focused on heterosexual men, heterosexual women. I also brought in a lot of quantitative data. And then these interviews with queer students, gay and bisexual students, I agree with you. I think 17 is small, and I think it's interesting. There's some themes definitely that are reoccurring in there, but I have been hesitant to try to make too broad of generalizations from that small of a sample. I'm more comfortable with 40, and I think a lot of people that are qualitative interview researchers sort of, at least in sociology, we sort of think of 40 as a magic number, or at least you're getting closer. It's not perfect. But I think it would be great if I could do another 20 interviews with gay and bisexual men. So maybe I will in the future. We'll see. But your point is well taken. That and one other thing I would say is I'm not trying to extrapolate this to all men of all ages or to men in international settings. This is very much focused on a large, private, urban campus, and there's a certain undergraduate sexual culture there that these men are talking about, and we need to be careful about expanding their stories and applying them everywhere. With that said, I do believe that men in their 20s and 30s, having talked to many of them at dinner parties about this topic, that these interactional pressures are still there. Yes?
Susan, you just said men in their 20s and in their 30s, but the average age is 19.9.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really young people.
Yes, yeah.
That seems to me that's a huge
Piece of this. Yeah.
And I'd like you to talk about that age factor. But then the other question is, was alcohol involved at all?
Oh yeah, two great questions. So the first question is this idea of learning. Do we learn how to navigate sex and learn how to navigate these scripts, and that this is something that is most likely to happen early in college? And what I would say is, just so you know, this was only college men. Mm-hmm, yeah, the sample was only college undergraduate men. Sorry if I didn't make that clear. Yeah, so it's only college men ages 18 to 25, since there's some seniors that are a little bit older. And, I got this question a lot when I was collecting this data. Is it freshman guys? Is this men that don't know how to navigate sex? And what I would argue is that there's some learning that does occur. I'd say this sample, slightly more men talked about things that happened freshman year, sophomore year. And what was nice is I asked men in interviews about, tell me about a great sexual experience. Tell me about a mediocre sexual experience. Tell me about now let's talk about the unwanted sexual experience. And so it kind of had I could see that these men had different types of experiences, so I could sort of get a within-person comparison. And that allowed me to see that, yes, some learning does occur. So I think some students get better at navigating these scripts and navigating these encounters to be able to better communicate their desires. With that said, this first quote I had from Jeff is a senior. Oh no, it's at the beginning. It was this one. Yeah, Jeff is a 25-year-old senior, and this was a Tinder date. So he's on a date with a woman that it's not clear to me that she knows any of his friends, and yet he's talking about how necessary it is. So it's this idea that I think these gender norms are so powerful that even in a scenario with a senior, and when I talked to him, this had happened 2 weeks before, a senior who has sexual experience, who's had sexual partners, he's on a Tinder date and still he feels this pressure that it's necessary to continue the interaction and that there's something that it would be too weird to stop it. So I think it's, what I would argue is that it's both. And then the other thing is alcohol. Yes, alcohol is definitely involved. I thought that that would be the main story here. When I went into this data collection, I was really expecting that these are going to be men who got too drunk and don't remember having sex with women. And 8 men out of 39 told me they were drunk, like real drunk, and a few men had said like I was tipsy or had had a drink or two, but only 8 men in the sample were really drunk, in their words. And what was interesting is that this idea of the interaction, it's necessary, it's weird, that really came up and hit me in the face. I was not expecting to find that. I didn't go into this with a position of with a presumption of an interactionist approach. This stuff really came out of the data itself. And so alcohol is part of it, and I've written papers on this and I talk more about the alcohol. I definitely think, alcohol is interesting because you have scenarios when men are really drunk and they have sex that was not consensual, that they didn't really have control over it. Sometimes they were so drunk they were incapacitated, they couldn't move, and afterwards they'll still tell me, well, at least I got laid and it wasn't like that big of a deal. And when that happens to a woman, she can leave that same scenario feeling extremely violated. And so I have a paper where I compare how there's something different, particularly with alcohol-facilitated sexual assault, that men and women leave that scenario feeling that they had more or less control. And I think it's really an interesting piece of this. Yes, there is a, yes.
I have 2 questions and points. First of all, in our family, we have 4 nieces that live here and 1 nephew who lives in California who was young and on a GBH radio show said false rape culture. So each of the nieces emailed him and called him to talk about what happened to them.
Yeah.
And he didn't respond to any of that.
Wow.
And the fact was, we kept saying to our daughters that, well, he's in high school, you just have to wait. And the final conclusion was, one of our daughters said, we're just trying to make you be a good friend to the women you'll meet in college. And he's now going to be a sophomore, and so we're all still waiting to acknowledge what happened there.
Yeah.
And so this is so interesting for me to hear. But the other thing that brought to my mind was, I'm not going to say his name right, Hank Azarian, the comedian.
Oh, Aziz Ansari.
Yes.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Who was on a date.
Yes.
With somebody he didn't know, and she was being very aggressive, and he shut it down, and he got me too. And he disappeared for a while from public life because of that. So it's very interesting you were talking about the power of what the woman says.
Yeah. The Aziz Ansari case, I mean, that one actually, there's such mixed accounts of that because in the media, some people are saying he shut it down. Other people they didn't have sex or intercourse. I think there was oral sex, but so a few pieces here. I mean, one, I think what's really interesting about talking to men is, one thing I didn't talk about here is men are very afraid of being accused of assault. They've all had these trainings pushed on them, and I think at times there is almost a fatigue by men of feeling like the prevention efforts are mainly focused on them as the aggressors, and that there's not really other conceivable scenarios, and they end up kind of feeling like they're afraid that they're going to get accused. They're afraid one of their friends is going to get accused. At the same time, a lot of these men are, very much are like learning to have sex themselves or learning to navigate it. And I think, I think this piece of what does he mean by false rape culture? I don't know. And why is he fighting that?
He's just, again, I think reeling from the statistics that he's hearing
Yeah.
about how many women are claiming that they were raped or sexually assaulted at his youthful age. He just can't believe that would happen.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, or that it's so dangerous that it's 1 in 4 women, or that that it's this prevalent. I think that's right. I think there's, I think it is. I think it's very loaded right now, and I think when I interviewed a lot of these men about it, and I said, well, how did you feel afterwards? A lot of them would say things like, well, I'm pissed off, and if I were a woman, I'd probably report her, and she'd get kicked out of school, and she'd get kicked out of class. But because I'm a man, I'm not going to ruin her life, and kind of separating themselves from female victims. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of doing masculinity in the event and doing it afterwards. But I think it's, really problematic. And this whole idea that, I didn't talk about women here today, but one thing that women talk a lot about is just feeling like they might be on a hookup and then suddenly it occurs to them, this guy's bigger than me. I don't know him that well. Like, what if he snaps? And this idea that, and sometimes the women are like, it's not clear to me that the man indicated he would use violence. He didn't threaten violence, but sometimes women will go along with the sex just in case it was going to escalate. And, what do we do with that? I think there needs to be more conversations with men saying, you need to know that you might intimidate a woman or you might intimidate another man without realizing that that's what's happening. And so, maybe that's an argument for more of this affirmative consent, for people checking in, for people, rewriting sexual scripts so there's more room to communicate throughout. I mean, another argument is some of these gendered scripts around women being polite and nice and men, being the pursuers, that it's time that we begin to rewrite some of these things. If it's an egalitarian moment in many other aspects of work and life, then we need to start rewriting these hookup scripts and these sexual scripts. So, and then what was your other thing? Was the Aziz Ansari? Yeah, I had a few men in interviews say, I think the woman wanted, she clearly wanted to have sex. I didn't want to turn her down because she might get mad and start yelling at me. She could even accuse me of something. So that was very much on their minds. I think I didn't realize I'd be working in this area for like 5 years, but it's so interesting and complicated that I keep finding new threads to like pull on. And there's just there's so many conversations to be had. So, yeah. Yes.
Something I'm curious about in your interviews, when you ask men to describe their a really good sexual experience, were most of those in a relationship, or were they in a strange encounter?
Strange. A lot of them are with. This is a whole other paper I'd like to write is the things you don't expect young men to talk about. I had men in interviews talk about love, how much they love their high school girlfriend, how important those experiences were, how like all of this anonymous sex felt really empty and made them really sad. A lot of men, some of the best sex they'd had was in relationships, but men also talked about there just being great chemistry, a connection, something that was really fun and wild or exciting. You meet some, European girl at a party and it clicks. So it was definitely a lot of the, I think a lot of the experiences that were comfortable, that were really good, were in relationships for men. And that brings up an interesting point, which is that 22 out of the 39 men, when they had unwanted sex, it was with someone they did not know very well. So a friend of a friend, someone they met at a party, a Tinder date. And I think that is interesting. This is getting too complicated into sociology, but it begins to suggest maybe these like stereotypes or these scripts or generic polite interaction things get heightened when you don't know someone. So you're more likely to act in these like stereotypical ways. Yes?
It just makes me feel sad to think about this. Maybe
I know
that there's no, with two people, it just seems like such a farce that nothing would stop. Nothing stops it from going that far. even if they're, both people don't want to do that, which is really interesting. I guess that's what it means when we, when there's no boundaries or no societal rules
Yeah.
in that world.
Well, keep in mind, it doesn't always go this way, right?
Yeah.
I'm interviewing men who this happened to and trying to work backwards and understand what happened. So just so you know, in some interviews, I did ask men, have you ever been able to get out of an unwanted sexual experience? And a few men had, and they told me, I thought this was really interesting. They told me how they did, and one, there's a negative cases. Andy reserved sex only for people he was like in love with, and he didn't care what other people thought about him. He was very emo in his words about who he would have sex with. So he says, I'll straight up say there's something you should know. We're not going to have sex tonight. I'm not going to wait until they try to do it and be like, no, because then they feel bad. Like, oh God, I'm sorry, or upset. I don't want it to be a surprise, really. But in the end, it is a bit of a surprise. So, and then a second quote, Luke describes an incident where he did not want to have sex with a woman, but ended up having it anyway during a party, but then they are interrupted midway. Someone opens the door, and at this point, he's able to stop the sex. And I said, do you think if they hadn't walked in, you would have finished? He says, yeah, because it was already happening. I'm not going to tell her we're done. Yeah, so I kept on going, but when the opportunity arose for us to stop, I took advantage of it. And I argue that these negative cases actually provide further evidence supporting the notion that these social processes are there. So even if you're going to say no, you've got to be polite. You have to not surprise them too much. And then also that one way to get out of unwanted sex is, that, you know, if there's something, this happened where someone opens the door, and women have told me about this, where they would have a guy in their dorm room and they had some signal with the roommate where if they wanted the guy to leave, she would text her roommate or do something. The roommate comes out and says, you know, hey, I'm having a problem. I need your help, you know, or I really have to. I got to put in my orthodontic mouth guard. You need to leave. You know that students. I mean, you can be. It's sad, and in some ways, doing these interviews was sad. And there's certainly extreme cases, and you know, there's students that had very sad cases, but there also were students who, you know, were sort of like, you know, this is part of the process of growing up, of coming of age, of learning how to communicate, learning how to have sex, and sometimes to have good sex, you need to also have bad sex. And so I think that's a whole other piece of this story that we don't, you know, that's hard. We sometimes have non-consensual or consensual, and then consensual becomes conflated with pleasurable and good sex. And so there's a lot of things going on where things are getting cut into binaries, and I think it's a lot more complicated. Yeah. Yes.
I love Andy's approach. I think he
Yeah.
solved the whole problem.
I know.
Except for women, because he's a man, so
Yes.
he can control the situation. If a woman said that,
Yes.
she could be overpowered.
Yeah.
It wouldn't necessarily work for a woman.
In the same way.
You know, bingo.
No, I think that is really right. I think that is really interesting. You're right. And hopefully what's happening with Me Too and with all these campus trainings is that we're building more and more room for women to say this and to navigate it.
And we need a strategy, and that's a perfect strategy. It's polite.
Yes.
It's not surprising anybody. It's not weird.
Yeah, it's not weird.
The only thing is that the word could get around, oh, he doesn't, you know,
Mhm.
you get on social media, you know,
Yep.
he's this, he's weird, he's strange. But if you have enough gumption or whatever it is.
Yeah, if you don't care.
Pull it off.
I think that's right.
How many college students have that kind of self-confidence? Right.
I know. Yeah, I know.
That's where parenting comes in.
That's
And
parenting.
I think that's
Mm-hmm.
a really good book on parenting, because a lot of high school moms and dads tell a ninth grade teacher I know that they don't know how to talk about Me Too with their sons.
Yeah, you know, I think that's why I continue to find this research on men and heterosexual men to be really important. No one's writing about this. There's not many studies going on, and the studies that exist are perpetrators, trying to identify the men who are aggressors. And I think, you know, there's so much here. Yeah. Yes.
Same thing as drugs. You say no if you don't want to take drugs.
Yes.
You get stoned, you know, with alcohol or whatever. But So it's a thing that should be taught from childhood.
Yeah, and
Wait till you get to college.
I think that's right. And saying no to drugs politely too is, why not? Probably good. Yes, Susan?
So in talking to the women that you talked to, I'm gathering that you tried to limit your sample to people who had had unwanted sex and to talk to them about it.
Backwards, yeah.
Yeah. But what have you found talking to women about occasions where they were able to say no, successfully say no, I want to do it without losing face, without causing the man to lose face? Or the women if it was a queer relationship?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I found women, so for women men are worried about looking like a wuss. Women are more worried sometimes about looking like a bitch or a prude or someone who led a guy on. And so the women, some of it's the same, like the woman I mentioned too, you have a code with a friend and you try to kind of interrupt the interaction and say, I have to go to bed. That's one way, that's sort of hands off. The women who had learned to say no, some of them said, I remember one woman, some of them said things like, I don't care if this guy's pissed off or if it's awkward afterwards, but I'm not gonna have sex tonight. And one of them recalled, it's interesting because the students talk a lot about what they're trying to avoid. They're trying to avoid awkwardness. They're trying to avoid these gender consequences. I think when people talk about sexual assault, we don't talk enough about that. Like that you're almost in the interaction saying, maybe if I have sex, it's easier because then it's not going to be awkward when I see him in class, which is ironic because you would think if you slept with someone, it would be more awkward to see them in class. It used to be, but some of my students felt like it was worse to say no. So I think, it's crazy. It's a group culture. And, pressure to be adults and to have a crazy time in college. It's all there. And probably, way more on women than it used to be. The women who said no had usually figured out, strategies of sort of not, in a way it was similar. Don't get in a taxi with a guy and go back to his room unless you know how far you want to go. Or if you're going to go back to a man's room, be clear before going in about what the expectations are and sort of don't get so far along in the interaction that it becomes too difficult to leave. And so a lot of the women talked about just knowing when they made certain decisions, knowing like what they were, knowing that even going to someone's room or going from NYU to Columbia and going to someone else's dorm might be signifying interest in sex, even if they didn't intend that. And sort of, I think there's this other thing that goes on with women that sometimes the women would feel like they were already labeled by even being in a man's room. So at that point, they were like, I feel like he already thinks I'm easy. I don't also want him to think I'm a tease. Therefore, I'm just going to have sex. And which is crazy because you would think in some ways this idea that women could say no would give them more of a clear exit, but the women did not always have a clear exit either.
They weren't, as far as you could tell, very much informed by this Me Too movement.
I mean, a lot of the heterosexual women people don't seem to be super, I mean, they do in some level, like they're aware of it, but they don't seem to be super capable of bringing that into navigating hookups. The women who I actually thought were the most articulate and kind of ahead are actually the queer women and the bisexual women who, because they've had sex with women or because they're sort of a little bit outside of that heteronormative scripting and pressured world, they don't necessarily want to go to those parties. They were a lot more capable of calling things out and labeling things and saying like, this is violating, I'm out. And actually thought that group was almost the furthest ahead in terms of redefining consent and sexual scripts. Yes?
Do you know I know discussing consent has become much more part of even young education. Is that maybe not unconsciously tilted toward men making sure that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So that seems like
what needs work.
Balance.
For sure. I mean,
that's just a equal back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the women in qualitative interviews, one of the women said, I asked about consent in this, and she said, consent, oh, that's what guys ask you, right? And it's like, well, no, women, it doesn't even occur to women to ask men for consent. Absolutely not. And, I think there were a few scenarios among these men where the men did feel sort of deliberately manipulated by the women. I think there are about 9 scenarios where the men felt more like the woman knew what she was doing. She was pushing it in a way that was more coercive and deliberate. And in most of the accounts, the men said, she didn't know what she was doing. She didn't mean to push me into this. But when the men suspected that the woman had done something more deliberate, the men were more pissed off. And if that is going on, then it suggests that women need to be educated too, that not all men want sex all the time. So, more reason for I just think these ongoing conversations, particularly on campus when a lot of people are really learning to have sex for the first time in the adult world, I think the more of these discussions we can have, the better. Yes?
Your presentation is wonderful.
Thank you.
And we are all in a certain age. Do you offer your program
Yeah.
to student college people to give them to make them understand what it's all about?
Yeah.
Because they need to know.
Yes. I mean, I've given this lecture in a lot of undergraduate classes, so yes. Yeah, I have. And I've had, but I think, I hear you. I mean, I think, it's one thing that I love being a sociologist, but I will say sociologists are not very good at intervention. We are really good at disentangling and picking out all the layers, but then we don't very often offer solutions. So I am sitting in a public health school now where public health is notoriously better at intervention and program. So hopefully over time I can use this and build towards real interventions and talk to students about this.
It's very important.
Yes, I think so. Thank you. Yeah, hi.
Do you think your data would be different with non-college students?
Yeah, I would love to conduct a study of how people decide who they're going to marry, how people navigate in their late 20s and 30s when people are looking for more long-term partners, how they deal with, hookups. The huge new piece of sexual and romantic life now is internet apps and the internet dating. And so I think if you interviewed people in their 20s or 30s, or even people who are divorced or who are dating again for the first time at any age, I really believe you get some of the same stuff, that the interaction can be awkward to manage. People want to avoid discomfort, and that can fit into people's decisions about how to navigate sexual encounters, and that there is gender stuff going on.
Have you done any of that, or you've only looked at this?
No, I've read a lot of literature, but the oldest people I've interviewed are mid-20s. But I will say, my research comes up a lot with friends and at dinner parties, and I've been in many places where people tell me, that happened to me when I was in my 30s, or I think this type of thing happens. I have anecdotal evidence that some of these pressures are there at all ages, but I think probably if I interviewed people in their mid-30s or 40s or 50s, you'd probably find some slightly different social processes operating.
Well, I meant the same age.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. I think all this, way too much research is done on college students. We need more research on non-college students of the same age. Oh my God, yes. Sorry. I don't know. I think some of this stuff would be there, but it could be different. In general, people think the rates of rape and sexual assault are higher in the same age group who is not in college. But no, national data has shown that. If you're not in college, what are you doing? You're probably working. You could be out. And in some ways, colleges are a protected environment. And as much as we want to say that this epidemic is happening on campuses, the national data I've seen, crime data, suggests rape is more common if you're not in college, near the same age. Which, no. Anyway. Okay. You're welcome.